on our end from when we say something to when it trips around the interwebs and makes it to them. But okay, let's go ahead and talk. I think that one of the things that came up just a second ago that is kind of news tonight is Alabama, I guess, losing a big time commitment to Michigan. And it's kind of been a thing the last year and a half that Alabama's not killing it like they were on the recruiting trail. Josh, I mean, we don't do a lot of recruiting. We're kind of X's and O's here, but is there some concern there that Saban's not locking them down like he normally does?
It's interesting. Now, they definitely lost a lot of recruits the last year. I mean, they lost some to Georgia. They've lost some, just kind of to everybody. A lot of that was early on was coaching turnover. If you follow recruiting, you know that most of the time recruits kind of tune in their junior year and figure out at that point who they're going to go to. That's when they start taking unofficial visits. They start talking to coaches. By the time their senior year rolls around, really, they already have most of the relationships from talking to coaches and texting and phone calls and whatnot, and they're just more trying to figure out where they want to take official visits. And that's why they usually have a group of 10. They whittle down to 5, and then the official visit list is who they look at as a senior, but it's all kind of solved. The problem is when Alabama has pretty much total coaching turnover in the past year, all those relationships that you built as juniors were gone. And so, when that happened, it kind of set them back a little bit. I don't know, I don't know that it's a really a huge thing. And I'm looking at it now. So, yeah, Dax Hill. Okay, it was Dax Hill, who's a 5-star safety, but he wasn't an Alabama commitment. He was a hip target.
No, I mean,
And was
I
expected to
said
go.
loss in that they lost him. Because I think Alabama fans felt like if it was down to Alabama and Michigan, especially with how Michigan was kind of struggling on the field this year, that he'd swing that way, but I guess not. All right, so we got to talk about Kentucky and Mississippi State because the weirdest name on all of our comments every week, Eli W3 Sup Y'all. And by the way, he got the apostrophe in the right place. So anybody that wants to say y'all, if you want to type it out, make sure you get the apostrophe in the right place and we won't give you hell about it. Kentucky and Mississippi State. This one, you had some observations about the Kentucky quarterback transfer. The kid was doing really good. Mississippi State, we nailed pretty well in the Kansas State game. I don't know what to think about these two teams because, Kentucky beat Florida, and that was a big deal to get over that hurdle. But is Florida any good? Do we know anything about Kentucky at this point?
I don't think we do. And that's not – I think sometimes when people say, well, we don't know anything about them, they instantly take it as a negative, right? And it's not fair. I think it's just as likely that Kentucky's actually quite good as they are quite bad. I mean, at times Kentucky's been pretty good. They beat South Carolina last year, right? And then they kind of fall off. And usually the problem has been quarterback play. Now that kid they've got he's not consistent, right? Hill is not a consistent quarterback. That means they're not going to be consistently good. At least you wouldn't think so. But he can make some plays. And there were a couple of vertical passes he threw in that Florida game. Obviously, the announcers kind of harped on it. It's quick aside, but it's always funny, I think, to both of us that you watch a game on TV and the announcers talk about something or talk about some play or some incident, and then you kind of see it parroted everywhere by everybody as their observations from the game, and they all kind of happen to match whatever the announcer said. But in that case, it was true. Hill hit some really big plays, but he wasn't a consistent passer. He wasn't terribly accurate, but just the ability to do something explosive in that offense is important. There have been a couple times in recent years where they didn't have a quarterback that could complete a forward pass, and it really the end of the Joker Phillips era got pretty sad. But I think with what they have, I don't know. It's hard for me to say how good Hill really is because I think he's going to be super up or down, but he does give them the ability to score on about anyone, and that's probably more important than anything else. I think the flip side here, And I think we're both of similar minds on this. Both of us are waiting to see what Nick Fitzgerald looks like when he plays anything resembling a real team and he's forced to throw the ball at anything resembling a real clip. And Kentucky may be Kentucky, but at the same time, they were able to stop the run as an SEC team to a certain degree. You can't just completely run them over. And because of that, I don't know, maybe they are able to just run the ball up the middle and run the ball with the running backs and use 2 running back sets, which is almost like seeing the wishbone. But I think they're going to have to throw the ball some. And if Fitzgerald can throw the ball accurately and consistently, it's one thing. But on the other hand, if Moorhead tries to run the offense that he ran with McSorley and he's throwing the ball down the field constantly, you start throwing away for possessions when you do that, if you're inaccurate, right? You can't just throw away downs. Even when you're playing group of 5, quote, cupcakes, you can't just throw away downs. If you watched our Auburn video where we previewed the LSU Auburn game, we had this whole discussion about what would happen if Auburn tried to attack LSU in the wrong way. And yeah, I see the screen's black. I assume Daniel's working on it.
It's coming back.
Yeah. And we kind of talked about, if they start trying to be too aggressive with Stidham, that aggression, it actually keeps you from scoring because you throw away drives. To be honest, it's kind of exactly what they did. It was the same darn thing they did last year against LSU where they got a lead. And then they kind of got cute and really aggressive. And, hey, look, we can see all the fun settings on Daniel's expensive camera. And it went away. So I think Mississippi State may have the same problem. It's going to be really big to me because I think Kentucky, one, do we know, is Florida really that bad? And I know they're not great. And they're struggling with, I say struggling, but they didn't beat Colorado State by a ton. Isn't a good sign. But it may well be that Kentucky's actually a pretty darn good team. We don't really know yet. And when they play Mississippi State, on one hand, we'll see how good Kentucky is relative to Mississippi State. On the other hand, that could be a close game. One, because Mississippi State could very well be overrated based off who they've played, or they may be underrated, or it may be a close game because both the teams are good or both of them are bad. But my biggest thing is to see, can Mississippi State, what kind of offense are they actually going to be able to run against an SEC team first? And then second, with Hill, how effective are they going to be, especially considering the past few years, Mississippi State's defense has been very aggressive. But I think last year they were one of the worst 20 teams in the country in explosive defense. That's going to be a problem with a guy like Hill that's sort of a pure aggressive passer.
And there's a question here. If Vandy didn't have 3 turnovers against Notre Dame, do you think they would have won? And might they make a run in the East? I hate to say this because I love for the SEC what Vandy did on the road to Notre Dame, but I think we saw a little bit. So one, I thought Sherman played well. He did what we said he probably would do in that he threw the ball better than Shea Patterson against the Notre Dame defense. But I thought that Notre Dame was largely inept. Their offense was awful. Their offensive game plan was terrible, and I am really, really not nearly as high on Notre Dame as I was after the Michigan game. I thought the Ball State game was a tune-up, but it looks like, it's a little scary. So I don't think they'll make a run in the East, but they can. I think they can position themselves in the East if they can beat Kentucky, because it's going to be Kentucky or Missouri in second place, it looks like.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with that. I think it's going to be interesting to see how Vandy holds up because they looked good at times last year and they looked bad at times, and that's kind of been the story with Mason. I'm going to move on to another comment here. I'm going to move on to the idea of impregnating, but definitely a lot of people talking about Tua. We honestly, when we've been talking about Alabama this year, we've been trying to find interesting discussion points and talk about strengths and weaknesses. And it's not really interesting just to say that Alabama is really, really good. But to be really clear, if anybody didn't pick up on this, Alabama is really, really good. And Tua is the best quarterback. Just a few games in, I can already say Tua is the best quarterback Alabama's had in 50 years. And then second, Tua is one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC in the past 20 or 30 years. I think that's really the question we're going to see coming into it. But I was having a discussion with somebody else today. If you want to talk about quarterbacks nationally, I think Will Grier gets a lot of credit. He plays in a conference where it's easy for him to get a lot of credit. But
But
outside of him,
yeah, but not
anybody
so
on Tua's level.
fast. Not so fast from Will Greer. He is the only quarterback that gave Florida an offense in the last decade, and it was and actually a really really good offense. So that I'm more impressed with that. I guess he's a freshman than I am with anything he's really done at West Virginia. Although I think he's got a pretty good wide receiving core with him too. So does that give you a little bit of a tip the scales that Will Greer might be a really good quarterback?
I think it's a fair point, certainly. I don't know how good or not good they were. It was so hard to see at what point they declined. We talked about a lot the fact that probably they declined more defensively than offensively in certain ways. The offense really fell apart. If anybody's ever watched our show at any point, you know that we really have a long-term hatred for the offensive coordinators that were there at in 2012 for Alabama and Auburn. That 2012-2013 period, Leffler and Nussmeier. It was kind of amazing what they did with what the talent they had. And I felt like offensively that pieces were there that they should have been successful. And Greer really had one good game, right? But I still think he's a very good quarterback. I'm just not sure that he's elite. He didn't look like a Heisman quarterback at Florida, put it that way. And at this point, really, their offensive line is so bad that no quarterback's going to be successful. And Felipe Franks, I thought he would take a step forward with Mullen, but that guy's head's just not in the game. He has no vision. He has no reads. It's kind of crazy how ineffective he is.
So I want to jump around real quick. Can we talk about Oklahoma and how I don't think they're elite? I didn't love, and we talked about this all offline. I didn't love that UCLA managed about the same awful game against whoever they played after Oklahoma. Who did they play this last weekend? Look it up, maybe. But anyway, somebody beat UCLA. Some crappy team beat UCLA.
Fresno State.
Yeah, Fresno State beat them as bad as Oklahoma did. And Oklahoma gave up 27 to Iowa State. That's like giving up 104 to LSU. I'm not impressed with them so far this year. I think losing their tailback is going to be a huge blow because that guy was wildly talented. Rodney Anderson, I think. And Kyler Murray, yes, it's kind of like the Tua thing where he hasn't played anybody and he's putting up big numbers, but I haven't seen the same level of play from him that I even saw from Baker Mayfield. But I saw the ESPN vote, all the ESPN writers, they have him number one right now on the Heisman, I guess because Tua is only playing a few drives and then they're shutting it down every game.
I think for all SEC fans, it's a little weird to see some of the stuff that comes out with that. One, it's weird that you've got Kyler Murray and Will Greer and Tagovailoa all in the Heisman discussion, and they were all transfer, either in the SEC or a transfer from an SEC school. It's kind of a strange thing in its own right. But if you watch the Iowa State game, Oklahoma moved the ball well, but it's not like they were completely dominant. And like you said, they throttled an FAU team where Murray was throwing easy passes to open receivers and the guy would run for 80 yards, which that's not really on the quarterback. And then, as you also noted, UCLA, there's a very, very good chance UCLA is going to go 0-12 this year. In fact, it's maybe even better than a 50-50 shot that UCLA is going to go 0-12. So I'm not sure that told us anything whatsoever. And Iowa State's also, by the way, not very good this year. They're not as good as they were last year. So I'm kind of with you. I think the Kyler Murray hype is a little early, and I don't know if you noticed, but everybody's blowing up with Georgia, Alabama. I don't know if you want to jump on that.
Yeah, everybody's talking about Georgia, Alabama. I think Alabama, I think is the number. We did tiers early in the year. We had Alabama as a tier 1, and Georgia, and nobody else in the SEC as a tier 1, and then Georgia as a tier 2, and then everybody else below that. Georgia has enough talent on their roster to give anybody a game. On the defensive side of the football, Alabama has proven themselves in the secondary to be pretty good, but make no mistake, Alabama with an elite defense has gotten into track meets before. They got in a track meet in 2015 with Clemson and had a good quarterback, put up a bunch of points, had a good throwing quarterback in that game. Coker was balling in the playoffs. So don't think that just because Alabama's got Tua and they could put up, say, 50 points on Georgia, that Georgia couldn't get in a rhythm and put up 40-something or make it a game. I think right now it's ridiculous. As much as I think Alabama is an elite team, it's ridiculous to think that Georgia couldn't be in a game with anybody. What do you think?
I agree with that. And one of the big things I think I'm curious to see from both Alabama and Georgia is they had turnover in their front seven. Alabama was pretty darn good in the playoffs, but they could be run on. And Georgia late in the game, really throughout the game, ran pretty well in Alabama. And there was a point where they were struggling to get Georgia off the field so they could get possessions to win it. And that was with Deron Payne, who was a first-round draft pick. I don't know if Alabama can stop the run at a high level. We haven't seen them play anybody that has a real run game yet. I'm not saying they can't by any means. I don't want you to take that away. But one of the things we talk about a lot is when you've got unknowns like that, don't assume that just because you're Alabama, you can stop the run. That's not the way things work. And it's not reality. So, we'll see how it goes. But I do think I don't take it for granted that Georgia can't score in bunches on Alabama. I do think Alabama has to be given the edge right now. I think their defense is better than anticipated because the secondary has proven to be so good, and their offense is pretty incredible so far. But it's too early to say anything on either team because neither team has really truly been tested. We talk about a lot that a lot of teams look really good when they play average to poor competition, and they play a good team. It's like you're looking at a completely different ball club when they actually play in a good game, and that's just true throughout any team in the top 15.
Austin plays 2K. 2K what? 2K19 because that game is awesome. The My Career mode is fantastic this year. Anyway, he asked if Auburn will beat Georgia. Right now, I would say no, and it's because what we said in the LSU preview, and that's why, look, a lot of LSU fans killed us for picking Auburn in that game and not picking LSU, which is what happens every game preview. Half the people kill us, and then half the people that we pick win get mad because, like, Georgia fans right now are getting mad that we're not picking them big enough. The spread was 9. We said Auburn by 4, 17-13, ugly game. And one play really turned that game on its ear at the end. That long bomb, I think it was 71-yarder from Burrow, was a great pass. Anyway, we said in our preview that Auburn's not running the ball well. That concerns us. Well, it turns out Auburn's not running the ball well, and they're not pass protecting well. So right now, I don't see them beating Georgia, but is it safe to say that this time last year we said we didn't see them beating Georgia, and then they really put it together in October?
It is true, and we made a big point of this in the LSU Auburn game that every year for about 5 games, Auburn looks very rough rather. And then at a certain point, they kind of click. And Malzahn has this whole thing. We've talked about it several times. They don't really do a whole lot of contact in practice, and they do repetition after repetition after repetition in his system. And over the course of the year, they start getting way better. So if you play Auburn at the end of the year, it's almost a different team than early in the year. I think defensively it's a huge deal. I think the lack of contact tends to mean that they don't really get good defensively until they've had real games. But, yeah, I think the bigger question is what options do they have? I know they're trying to make changes in the offensive line, and the offensive line is the thing that's going to have to change first and foremost. But they definitely need to get a Whitlow, more involved in the offense and more effective, because Cam Martin is not the answer in that offensive scheme. Neither one of us thought that going into the year, and it seems to be true. Whitlow has a little bit of spark, but he's still not Kerryon Johnson. And regardless, none of that's going to matter. If they don't get the offensive line shored up, they're not going to beat Alabama or Georgia this year.
So we got a comment from a Texas fan. Thomas says hook 'em. I guess he saw the TCU video. Thomas, in the comments, let us know what you think about Texas in this game, and maybe we'll circle back around on it. Somebody says, why are we talking about Auburn? LSU is the team in the West this year. We do need to talk about LSU a little bit. I think the difference in that game is Brissett was running the ball. And yes, Whitlow did get a little bit of momentum in that game, but Brissett seemed to be the one that was running it well enough to keep a little bit of the defense honest, to keep Burrow somewhat clean. But that defense, man, look, you lose an NFL caliber linebacker or anybody on your defense, that's a huge hole to fill, and they didn't miss a beat, man. And I could not believe 4th and 1, Devin White didn't get blocked. That was crazy. But that defense is nasty.
LSU is still an enigma to me. And I talked to you in the second quarter that about the middle of the second quarter, I thought that everybody was going to give us crap because I thought Auburn was about to run away with the game. And we talk about a lot. some people want to hear you predict, well, I think this game's going to come down to the fourth quarter, and then they're going to get one team's going to get a special team score, and then it's going to come down to a last-second field goal, the Lee Corso prediction. That's silly. You don't know how the flow of the game is going to go. Our goal in our videos is more to tell you, here what we think are the key matchups and the thing one team is going to do and the things the other team's going to exploit. Like, for example, Auburn's going to throw the ball way too much down the field when it isn't working. LSU is going to try to stay conservative. It's going to be a close game. It's going to be difficult for either team to score 20 points. Those were all points we made. I think they were all true. The reason, though, I said LSU is such an enigma, one, defensively, we didn't spend as much time on it as we should have in that video, but we both thought they were a top 5 unit. But the trick was sort of more how or if the offense could move the ball. LSU in S&P Plus, they have a thing that talks about the percentage of whether a team should or should not win the game. I forget what they call it, but basically, if you have this production against your opponent, like what all the stats are in the game, what are the odds that you actually win? And LSU only had a 14% chance of winning that game against Auburn in S&P system based off all the game stats. And they're usually pretty consistent with that on S&P. But what's kind of telling is, like a lot of people mentioned, Burrow is the second lowest completion percentage in college football at 46%. He's between the UNLV and UTEP quarterbacks. I'm not taking anything away from LSU, but it's a prime example of how if you have a top 10 defense, you can stay in any game you play, and you can win a game even though when you're being beaten. I mean, Auburn really play-to-play outgained and beat LSU. They just didn't win on the scoreboard. That means all the credit for the win should go to LSU. But on the other hand, if you're talking about what team is the better team down the road, what S&P says and what I tend to hedge towards is to say Auburn still is probably the, quote, better team. If you want to say who's more likely to beat Alabama tomorrow or whatnot, that's a different question than who's better in the rankings, right? And Auburn came away from that game still looking like the better team than LSU. And I don't know. I mean, is it going to be that LSU ends up being able to find lots of ways to win in every game because of their defense, or is this more when they got lucky in that they hit a couple of big plays, especially that long pass? I don't think he even sees Deshaun Davis, and if he throws that 6 inches lower, it's a pick. And that one little difference, and we have a completely different conversation. I think,
but he didn't, and they won the game, and they won it on the road. So for all of Auburn's not taking anything from anybody there in Auburn last year, they lost a game at home, and that's a big deal to win in that place. So I think, yes, in the middle of that game, so second, third quarter, really, it looked like Auburn, but first quarter it didn't. First quarter, it looked like LSU was going to run away with it. So I do think Auburn poses a particularly tough challenge for Alabama that LSU may not, in that, and we saw that last year. But LSU, I think they deserve their due. But since Auburn lost this game and LSU won it, let's talk about LSU Mississippi State, because that's an interesting matchup to me. I know everybody in the comments is talking about LSU Georgia right now, but LSU Mississippi State, I think that's pretty interesting because they're so different.
Yeah. One thing, and I don't want to, looks like people aren't freaking out too much. I don't want anybody to take away that I'm saying LSU isn't a very good team. My point was that was very much a game where just because LSU won and Auburn lost, I wouldn't jump to any conclusions on which team is or is not better. I don't think that was really settled. What got settled is that LSU has a win and Auburn has a loss. But LSU pass protected pretty darn well. Burrow a lot of times had a really clean pocket, which was very impressive because Auburn does have a very good defensive line. Obviously, LSU's defense is really good, but that offensive line is going to be a tough matchup for Mississippi State, I think, because their defense was, as we talked about earlier, one of the worst in the country in explosive plays allowed, and they really relied on the defensive line kind of dominating a game. And if you could get the ball to the linebackers or secondary, the linebackers were good, but they're like Leo Lewis is big. They're not necessarily the fastest guys, and then the secondary gave up a lot of big plays. LSU is going to have a chance to sort of get, not let the Mississippi State defensive line or the defensive line, take over the game, give their guys on the outside a chance. They've got better athletes on the skill positions and perimeter than Mississippi State does in the back seven. And then on the flip side, The real question is, can Mississippi State run it on LSU? Last year, they played a really banged up LSU. When they didn't have a healthy Trevor Lawrence and those other guys, Troy ran all over LSU. They had real issues with that due to injury. And when those guys came back in the second half of the year, it was a completely different team. I don't know that Mississippi State's going to be able to run the ball at will in LSU this year because they do look, assuming they're healthy, and then all of a sudden that game gets really, really tough for Mississippi State. And I will say right now, I would probably hedge to saying that LSU would be likely to win the game based off the matchups I'm thinking of at the moment.
Jared says Texas A&M is underrated. And by the way, the question about the beer, no, it is not any sort of Bud Light Rita. It's a Divide and Conquer double IPA. It's excellent. I had a snake handler that I was ready to drink and I lost. It wasn't cold. So anyway, is Texas A&M underrated? Yes. Are they probably not going to cover this weekend? Yes. Can Alabama cover this spread and Texas A&M still be a top 10 team? I think they can. I went back and watched the Clemson game again, and Kellen Mond, if for people that didn't see the game, Kellen Mond moved the ball well on non-touchdown drives. They missed a field goal in the first drive. They came right back down the field with it. You talk about taking a couple of plays away. You take away the cross-field 3rd and 12 or whatever that Kelly Bryant had, and then the ridiculous weird play that Trevor Lawrence had in his first pass of the game. That game is completely different. So, yes, I think A&M is underrated. Josh, what do you think about the question that I asked? Can Alabama cover this game and A&M still be a top 10 team?
Well, I absolutely think so. I think I actually said that in the video too. I
don't really pay attention to what you say in the video.
I noticed, but a refrain I often talk about in college football is there's kind of two things. One, everyone assumes that because a team was good at something the year prior, they're going to be good the next year. That's not true. Missouri had a dominant defensive line for several years up until the year they didn't, and all of a sudden the defense was terrible. You don't just magically turn a 3-star into a first-round draft pick every year. There's a lot of luck involved with what Missouri was able to do there. And the second thing is college football is not fair or even, and it is possible for one team to be just ridiculously dominant. It doesn't happen terribly often, but it can happen. And 2001 Miami never really got challenged. I'm not saying Alabama's 2001 Miami, but there's a lot of signs that they are 2001 Miami. And it may be possible right now. I would say that I would probably put Alabama a 2-score favorite over at least everybody but Georgia and Ohio State. And honestly, I haven't really had enough time to think about it, but I know S&P has them a 1-touchdown favorite over Ohio State and Georgia. I'm not sure that's unreasonable based off what we've seen this year. And it's not taking anything away from anybody. It's just, put it this way, 2018 Alabama, would you agree with this? 2018 Alabama would beat 2017 Alabama by 2 or 3 touchdowns.
Yeah, I said that in the comments. Somebody was talking about how there's no way Alabama covers versus A&M, and they referenced the team last year. I said right now, Alabama with Tua playing is probably a 14 to 17 point favorite over Alabama last year with Jalen playing.
Somebody asked if TCU still has a chance in the playoffs. I would say, unfortunately, no. Losing to Ohio State. I mean, they could win the Big 12, but at this point, the SEC is going to get in. The ACC is going to get in. The Big Ten is going to get in if it's Ohio State, even if they have a loss. So they'd have to hope there's nobody else, and I don't think that.
Well, the question is, so Ohio State, the Big Ten is kind of dropping. So I do think the winner of Penn State and Ohio State probably does go on. But what if Wisconsin wins the Big Ten or something weird? Like, because there's so many bad losses already in the Big Ten that they're in trouble, and it's not unprecedented for them not to make it in. So I agree. I think TCU might be on the outside looking in because of the loss, but I don't. For me right now, they're my favorite to win the Big 12.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think they've got like you were saying, they have more than a puncher's chance of beating Oklahoma. I just think, the problem you're pointing out with the Big Ten, I'm not sure anybody can stop Ohio State in the Big Ten. and they could
I
have
don't
another
think they
Iowa
can
game.
either.
I don't think even if they have another Iowa game, if they win the conference, they're probably still going to get a benefit of the doubt. And the problem with those games is, let's say, same problem. One of the issues, right? Ohio State had last year. If TCU wins the conference with a loss, and then Ohio State wins with a loss to a crappier team, the fact that Ohio State was TCU's loss is going to really pay heavily in the playoff committee's mind. Now, I'm not saying who deserves it. I just think that's the way the committee is going to think. But really, the whole question becomes down who's the fourth team, and that one's a lot harder to get. At some point, by the way, we should probably talk about Florida, Tennessee, even if it's for 5 minutes, because
Yeah,
we'll ask about
and somebody asked in the comments when we posted one of the games this week. We actually posted a link to a model. You ran a quick model of it. If I'll talk about it for a minute while you look that up, but what scares me about this game, it's actually a pretty close spread. I want to talk about the team that doesn't win this game, and if you're a Florida fan, you probably gotta want, like, if you're on the losing end of this game, it's kind of devastating. You don't feel as bad as Florida State, but you feel pretty bad. And I wonder how much of this is quarterback and how much of it is just the entire team. But it's crazy that it got so bad so fast. And it's kind of like with Florida State. Florida State is on another level, and that's what I actually wanted to talk about when we first started this thing, is just how bad they are. It's kind of unprecedented. But on the Tennessee side, I think they knew they had a rebuilding year coming in. I think neither one of these teams have really found a quarterback, and I don't know. I mean, what's the model say? Have you found it?
Yeah. So the model has Florida 20, Tennessee 17. And I think the sad thing from that is we already know Tennessee's really bad because of who they played and how they've looked. And then we talked about the Kentucky question. They're about dead even. It's kind of weird. Florida is, in our model, is predicted to have 5.85 yards per play. Tennessee is expected to have 5.84 yards per play. Basically, Florida gives right at your season averages offensively, and then Tennessee is a little better against the run, and then is pretty darn bad against the pass. But it's almost a dead heat between these two teams. And our model favors Florida slightly, but especially this early in the year, you could basically consider this a dead even game.
And here's a quick point from me, and somebody else mentioned this in the comments, and I think this bears repeating. Tennessee beat UTEP 24-0. They scored 24 points on UTEP. UNLV scored 52 points on UTEP, and the Northern Arizona Lumberjacks scored 30 points on UTEP. And I know they had a kneel down late, and they could have scored enough to make it maybe 30-0, which would have been as good as Northern Arizona. But y'all, come on, that's these two teams have a level of offensive production that does kind of compete with Florida State.
Yeah, if you were asking me to pick the game, by the way, I know what the model says. I'd have Florida by like 2 scores. Tennessee has, when they've played somebody that's real, struggled so badly that I have no faith in them, and the only points they put up have been against terrible teams. And at least Florida could move the ball at times against teams. Granted, Colorado State is absolutely atrocious too, but
don't tell Arkansas that.
Yeah. Yeah, they got demolished by Hawaii in week 1 and then beat Arkansas. God bless them. We feel terrible because we've had to give Arkansas fans so much grief just because we keep predicting them to lose by 40 every time we do a game, and it's nothing on our end. We kind of want them to look better. Just the past few years, they've unfortunately been that bad, and this year they're probably the worst SEC. Honestly, they're probably the worst SEC West team in decades. They're particularly terrible.
Let's see.
Yeah.
I am absolutely happy for Kansas, and I'll tell you why both of us are over the moon happy for Kansas. I don't know if there's any Ohio State fans in here from that Rivals thread, but we were having a discussion on the Rivals message board, the premium message board for Ohio State, because they're talking about SEC scheduling. And there was we mentioned in our show, our preview, when we were really fair to Ohio State, predicted a blowout. We've always been pretty fair. We've always said that Ohio State is kind of one of those elite above and beyond teams. We got a lot of respect for that program. We said we didn't know much about them because they had opened the season with 2 cupcakes. And somebody in the forums was just it flew all over them that I said Rutgers was a cupcake. And me and Josh both kind of tag teamed the comments on that, and we're like, look, they are 0-12 since joining the Big Ten against teams that finished in the top 4 that year, the Big Ten. One year they lost 58-0, 39-0, and like 74-0 to the best 3 teams in the Big Ten on their schedule. That's the definition of a cupcake. And they're like, no, it's still not like an FCS team that an Alabama and Auburn schedules. It's nowhere close. And then they go out to Kansas and get just absolutely skull dragged. So yes, to answer your question, we are very happy for Kansas, not just for Kansas, but also because it was like instant schadenfreude.
Yeah, and to elaborate more on that thread he's talking about, and it was mostly a good discussion. There were just it was just a few guys there are some people that are completely divorced from reality out there on the internet. It's going to shock everybody to hear that. But he's like, yeah, well, we've got a lot of good teams, and there's bad teams in the SEC too. Like, you got like Kansas. I mean, you got Rutgers, and you got like Rutgers and Maryland and Illinois, and they're basically the same as, Vandy, Kentucky, and Mississippi State. We're like, wait, what? Mississippi State? They're like, yeah, I mean, they're Mississippi State. I mean, you got to be real. They're not any good. Like, they're a top 10 team, right? Like they would have throttled Rutgers any time in the past 10 years, and they didn't even want to hear it. I mean, they're just fans of certain conferences just don't live in a reality. They don't watch any SEC football, and they have no freaking conception of how good one team is versus another. And it says a lot about some fans that they actually think that Illinois and Rutgers, who, by the way, were all worse than anybody in the SEC has been, are on the same level. And I'll say one thing before I let you talk again, but we've talked a lot about strength of schedule with Ohio State versus Alabama last year in the playoffs. And one of our things we talked about was teams that were ranked 95th or worse nationally, and how many of those were scheduled. Stop harping on Mercer. That's where this whole discussion came in with Ohio State. And our point was there's 2 teams. Alabama played 2 teams that were 95th or worse nationally. One was Tennessee, one was Mercer. And Ohio State played, I think it was 5. And it was like Illinois and Rutgers and Maryland. And it's UNLV was another one. And it's like, look, none of these teams are really any freaking different than if you're playing Mercer. If you're Ohio State, you're going to destroy them 60-0 anyway. And they absolutely would not hear the fact that, not just that Rutgers was bad, but that Rutgers would be significantly worse than Tennessee.
Somebody asked a question about how A&M is 6th nationally in time of possession. If they control the ball for 35 minutes and keep the ball out of the hands of Tua, do they have a chance? And somebody followed up in the comment and said it maybe not, because with Tua, Alabama's scoring. I think they showed a drive chart in the Alabama game. His first 5 possessions were like 3-3-3, 6-3-3, and 4 of those were touchdowns. So, but I will say that, yes, I've said this in multiple posts, in comments on message boards and stuff this week, that A&M needs to focus on, I think, slowing the game down a little bit. And we know Jimbo is good about getting first downs with a tight end, getting first downs with a fullback, slow the game down a little bit, and force a couple of turnovers, because if you do that, you can basically take a quarter of the game worth of possessions off the board for Alabama. And yes, you may still give up touchdowns every time that Tua's got the ball, but you need to focus less about scoring a bunch of points and more about keeping the ball away from Tua. We saw what Ole Miss tried to do. They tried to come out bombing and win 75-50, and they got destroyed. You got to run your normal offense. A&M is a much better opponent for that. So I think that's the better approach.
Yeah, and 2 quick points, and that's one, teams make a mistake whenever they come out and say we need to do X in order to win this game, because for the most part you're doing something that you aren't used to doing and you don't practice, and you're not going to be as good at it. We talk about sometimes when you play a team that's better than you have to be over aggressive, knowing that 75% of the time it's going to get you blown out because it's the only chance you have to beat them. And Ole Miss and their style of offense is a poster child of that, because they could beat Alabama and then lose to, a just above average Arkansas team later in the year. And the second point I'll make is time of possession in current tempo offenses, I think, is also overrated. Texas A&M has run 240 plays this year. Alabama has run 213 offensive plays. And the fact that Alabama has less, quote, time of possession doesn't matter to me nearly as much as how many snaps each team has in the game. And honestly, I think having less time of possession, but with this, if you have less time of possession, but you have the same number of snaps, that means you snap faster and faster. I think that wears the defense out more than if you have more time of possession, but you have run more clock off every play and the defense is on the field more. Plus, some of it is just whether it's a run or a pass and whether the play clock's stopped or not, which in terms of whether you're wearing the defense out is pretty meaningless, I think.
Yeah, I don't think it's wearing the defense out. I think it's just you got to keep the ball away from Tua. I do wonder, though, like someone said something, and we've seen this a lot this week. If Alabama stays in 4 quarters, Tua could score hundreds of points. It's getting a little bit ridiculous, but is this a game where we see, even if Alabama gets up early, where we see Tua play longer than he has been playing, just for, if nothing else, Saban fears A&M more than he maybe did with Ole Miss?
I think so. And we got roasted from Alabama fans by saying that Jalen would probably come in. I said that I thought Jalen would come in when Alabama was up 30 points so they could slow down the game and try to get out of there. And everybody thought it was ridiculous. And whether or not it was a bad point, I'm just going to note that Alabama did exactly what I thought they might do. They put him in, I think they were up 29 points. But in this game, I do agree with you. A&M this year is not the quick play offense that Ole Miss is. By the way, Ole Miss is still in S&P. They're the number 1 offense in the country. So Alabama did absolutely want to run clock and get out of there. Alabama's probably fears A&M more on both sides of the ball. They're going to want to have a more comfortable lead and they're not just going to want to kill the clock immediately. They're also going to want to score points and keep running their offense. And I also, I talked about this before, but I could see the score being still pretty rough, like 40-10 or something. But there's a difference between the Louisville score, which was Alabama got to 40-7 in the second quarter, and then nothing happened for the rest of the game. And the A&M game, where I think you're going to see something more like a 40-10 score that takes the entire game to get to that point. And for that reason, you'll see a lot more of Tua.
Vincent asks, do we think LSU is for real with Coach O, or is it a 2012 Florida? I think you know what I mean. We do know what you mean, and I still am, we've been pretty critical and been consistently critical of Coach O. I hate his offensive coordinator hire this year. You can't hire your buddy. Coach Mack did it at Florida, hired Nussmeier, and it cost him his job and his entire career arc, and he hung with him. You cannot hire your buddy unless he is an elite coach. But I will say, as long as Dave Aranda's there, LSU's floor is 9 games, maybe 8 games with a brutal schedule. But Dave Aranda, I've got a lot of respect for him, and they're still going to recruit well. It's a talent-rich state, talent-rich area. I don't, but the issue is, and Josh, I'm going to let you chime on this a little bit. The issue is not whether you can win a bunch of games. Can you win 8-9 games at LSU? That should not be LSU standard. LSU standard, they fired a guy who was he was a walking soundbite. Everybody loved him, ran a classy program. They fired him because he wasn't winning national championships. You can't replace him with somebody and be okay with him winning 8-9 games a year. You need to replace him with somebody who's got a chance to win your national championship. And Orgeron is not a national championship head coach. If he got out of the way and got a real offensive coordinator, no offense, y'all, got an elite offensive coordinator like he has an elite defensive coordinator, I think he could be. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah. Les Miles' biggest strength at LSU really was that he had excellent coordinators. That's what he did. And I don't know that Les Miles was a great coach. Frankly, I think a lot of the decisions he made, the Mad Hatter stuff, was just stupid. The 2007 team that won the championship with 2 losses, they benefited from some crazy stuff, but the truth is they were a hell of a lot better than most everybody else in the conference that year. And there was really no reason that 2007 LSU should have lost to Arkansas. But by and large, they were consistently good because you had great coordinators and good coaches. And offensive coordinator, it's easy to rag on. I did feel like Miles got obsessed with dual threat quarterbacks for years, and that probably
with a
cost
pro
him.
style offense.
Right. He always wanted a dual threat quarterback, and he'd run a pro style offense, and then he'd stick Jordan Jefferson in there. And I used to jokingly talk about how they had the non-running quarterback and the non-throwing quarterback, that they'd take Jefferson was the pocket passer, and they tried to run dual threat. I'm not going to go further on what that maybe says, like what stereotypes they were filling in Miles' head, but yeah, I think you can be successful. I think Orgeron could be successful with great coaches. Ensminger's not the right choice. My concern with him and your concern with him is I've never seen any indication that he has the organizational skills it takes to run a program. I watched some of that Alabama preview thing on ESPN for their season. We talk about Alabama a lot. I'm sorry. They're just kind of the common talking point in the SEC. They had, like, in the meeting room, it was just binders, floor to ceiling binders of game plans and practice schedules and meal plans. It blew my mind how much information they had produced, all the material they produced for that football program. And I'm sorry, you cannot tell me there's any way that Ed Orgeron spends hours a day going over binders of academic training schedules and marking it up to send it back to coaches or staff. I just don't see that happening.
Horatio says, worst offensive coordinator ever, Doug Nussmeier. I don't think you will get any disagreement from Josh and I. We've got a 3-year history of just killing the guy. We're probably going to start getting hate mail from him. I mean, we have been consistently low on him, dating all the way back to, 2012?
2012 Alabama was one of the most talented offenses in the SEC in the past decade. And they didn't realize it until the SEC championship game in the second half, where they went, oh, crap, Eddie Lacy, that might be an NFL tailback. Hey, look, we've got like 3 first-round draft picks on the offensive line. Maybe we should do the power run and throw to this Amari Cooper guy deep. And they took him to the championship game to actually figure that out.
All right, so let's see. So somebody said that someone hired Mazzoni and it cost him his job. I disagree. I think someone's just a bad coach.
Well, I said it joking that he he did hire his buddy and that didn't help him. I was joking later that he also hired him again at Arizona, which was kind of bizarre to me given how that went. But yeah, no, I think both of us agreed with this. It was like every year they got more fundamentally bad. I think my opinion has always been that A&M took Sherman's team that was very fundamentally well coached, had a lot of talent at good positions. They had a first-round draft back to the defensive line, pretty good defense, good linebackers, good pass rushers. They had a ton of talent at receiver. Who was it? Swope, that ended up being didn't get medically cleared, so everybody's forgotten him because he didn't play in the NFL due to concussions. But he was actually the star receiver, and you had Mike Evans, everybody else. Someone inherited those guys. He gave them motivation, and he ran an aggressive system. But the talent he had was insane. If you had 3 first-round draft pick offensive tackles on that line, one of which was playing guard or center because they already had 2 to play tackle, I've always felt like that team underachieved to lose 2 games when you look at the NFL talent that was on that squad. But he installed an offense that could at least make some use of them. And then from that point on, it's like every year they got less and less well coached. Sometimes I think you get coaches like that focus so much in installing an offense and a scheme, they forget to teach you how to block and tackle. And I'm serious. And you see them come in year 1 and year 2, they're great. I think Chiswick did that at Auburn because they came in and installed this aggressive offense and they kind of turned the D around that was experienced. But years 3 and 4 and 5, all of a sudden you see all that time they spent on the offense, they were good in year 1 and 2. Yeah, they forgot to also teach the backups how you block or teach the running backs how to, handle contact and not fumble the ball. And that's kind of my criticism on someone.
You got to give Muck a shout out. He's like I think he's the first commenter every time.
Muck the Duck. Time. I don't even see him in here, and I know who he is.
How would Texas A&M possibly upset Alabama? Maybe if Jalen played the whole game, I think that would be a close game. That's how much difference Tua makes to Alabama or to any team, in my opinion. I think this is actually a really close game if Jalen plays. I think it's, what did I pick? 47-17, 43-17, something like that with Tua. It's just all the guy that's doing the videos, everybody eats, and he's doing the film review. It's hilarious, but it's true. I've never seen, like, we've seen, everybody in the country have seen this Alabama team struggle offensively to get their playmakers the ball and spread the ball around effectively to properly utilize all the 5-star talent that's on this roster year in and year out. And Tua is finally doing it. Would you say that's fair, that, like, you picked your score, I think 41-10 or something like that, with Jalen, it's probably a close game?
No, totally fair.
I mean, that's Clemson. That's who Clemson is. Kelly Bryant is Jalen Hurts 2.0. He's a little bit better than Jalen, maybe, but that's who they played at home, and we saw how close it was.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the Clemson otherwise, Alabama has better receivers, but frankly, I don't think Jalen is one. Take a step back. If people remember when we did the A&M Clemson game, we talked about how much of a mistake it was going to be if they played Lawrence. Kelly Bryant was actually pretty effective in that game for Clemson. He just they had 13 possessions. He only had 8 of them because they gave 5 to Lawrence. And Lawrence threw a pop pass to Higgins, who went up, snatched the ball away. Tucker took a bad angle, and Higgins ran the rest of the way for a touchdown. After that, I think Lawrence had 1 first down. But the point being, I think the Clemson game was a pretty good indication of what Alabama would have looked like if they had played. Alabama would have been similar, better in some ways, worse in others. I think Bryant's a better quarterback as Alabama, but the problem is with Tua, Alabama's on a completely different level, and they're just able to move the ball way more effectively.
So Cody Hayes says he thinks that Tua makes dumb mistakes and A&M takes advantage. That's funny because I think so, including all of the garbage time he played last year, because he played a lot last year, national championship game, and all the games that he's played this year. I've seen every game. I've seen him, honest to God, I've seen him make 3 mistakes. The pick 6 against Tennessee, the ridiculous interception against Georgia, and then he misread he thought, do you remember it was the Arkansas State game? He thought it was in the red zone, and he had a boundary wide receiver.
Oh, yeah, they dropped.
It was cover 2. He thought they were dropping into cover 2, and it ended up they rolled into man, and he threw it right at it was a perfect throw. It would have nailed the wide receiver, but he misread the coverage. Those are the only 3 mistakes. Like, yes, I feel like when he makes a mistake, it's an interception mistake, but I think Alabama fans would take 1 or 2 of those a game with 10, 11 touchdowns if they needed them.
Yeah, no, and I remember, I think he thought it was man, it was actually zone, and watching it live at first, it looked like he just made a dumb throw. And then I slowed it down, rewound it, and we text back and forth like, wait a second. We realized they'd actually done something screwy with coverage and bailed, and that just confused him because he made the decision so fast. It's like, wow, that wasn't even really a mistake. It was just a really good play design by Louisville. I do think he freaks out when he doesn't have a play. He's not very good at throwing the ball away when he should. He tries to make a hero play most plays. He was really bad about that in his limited time as a true freshman. I think that's why they didn't play him until the bowl game. I don't think it was crazy they didn't play him because of that. They've had to break him of it a little bit. I still don't think he's there. The problem is he is so daggum good at the hero play that just because he's always trying to make one, he's more likely to, as we've seen, more likely to throw a touchdown pass than an interception. And with their defense being as good as it is, even if he throws an interception, there's a pretty good chance they're going to stop you from getting points. So it's just daggum brutal. It's hard to say exactly how you beat them this year.
Will Elko be able to confuse to it? Maybe. I think he's a good defensive coordinator. This goes back to the whole, can Alabama cover and still be an A&M be a top 10 team? I think so. Let's talk about something else. If you had to pick Mississippi State, Kentucky, just off shooting hip, no model, what's the score in that game?
I would go Mississippi State, and I don't think it's that dramatic, though. I think probably something like 31-20. I think Mississippi State should be able to run the ball fairly consistently. And I think the problem with Kentucky is they're going to be able to score with this quarterback, but he's not consistent enough to really. They're going to struggle to score more than 24 points against good teams or good defenses. It's just kind of a matter of every year when you play Kentucky with that quarterback, it's going to be really variable whether they connect on those balls and they put up 30 or whether they miss on a bunch of them and they only score 10. And they're probably going to beat somebody they shouldn't, and they're going to lose to somebody they shouldn't because of it.
Can we talk a little bit? So
let me interject one thing before I forget. On Sumlin, an interesting point, and I'll say it on this live thing, but I've heard repeatedly with Sumlin that he probably needed to take a year off, and it's to a certain degree it's gossip, and people don't want to talk about it in the national media, which I get. But something to note with him is I think that guy has. I've heard repeatedly that guy has some personal issues that he probably needs to have addressed. So not a wonderful thing to talk about, but I felt like saying it because I think it's interesting to most people.
Is it fair to say that Kentucky is a much better team than the Kansas State team that Mississippi State beat pretty bad?
Oh, yeah, it's not close. Kentucky would be a multi-score favorite over Kansas State. Kansas State is terrible.
Okay, one question that keeps coming up with so many good teams in the SEC this year, how many, you can't have all of them in the top 10. So how many are legitimate top 10? And we've seen this before and we've seen it in other conferences too. This isn't like a SEC sunshine pumping thing. We saw this particularly in 2015, and I always like to bring this up because people say SEC's down, SEC's down. They say it every year. Eventually, it's going to be right. In 2015, Alabama, on the way to the national championship, played something like 8 teams that won at least 9 games, and the SEC went 9-2 in bowl games and had the largest average margin of victory in bowl history. So you had a lot of teams that were like 9-4 at the end of the year or 8-5 at the end of the year that in another conference would have been 11-1, 10 or 10-2. Because we saw that not only were they playing teams with the same record as them in bowl games from other conferences, they were blowing them out. So in the top 10 this year, I think it's tough because I think the SEC West is going to be brutal. I think it's going to be a bloodbath because I think A&M, LSU, and Auburn are all right there, and they can all beat up on each other, and Mississippi State. Sorry. So what do you think? Like, is it going to be a bloodbath and none of them are in the top 10?
I don't know. I think it's pretty obvious that Alabama and Georgia, odds are going to be in the top 10. So first off, you got those two. LSU's problem is they have to play Georgia this year. So Auburn and LSU both, right now, you would expect them probably to both lose both those games. And that puts Auburn at a minimum 3-loss team. So they're looking at best case 9-3, and LSU would be looking best case 10-2. I know it's not a certain thing. Don't take it that way, but I'm just saying if you say they lose to who they more than likely not would lose to, and obviously if they win those games, it's going to knock Alabama and Georgia back. So that's all a net loss, right? And then based off that, you step back and you go, well, what about Texas A&M and Mississippi State? I think there's a real chance Texas A&M and Mississippi State could beat Auburn or LSU, and so. I'm going to hedge a little bit and say it's probably 3-4. You can have Alabama and Georgia in there easy. Somebody between Mississippi State, Auburn, and LSU is going to win the majority of and Texas A&M is going to win the majority of those games. They could get 4 in if Mississippi State and Texas A&M end up being very good teams and they win out except for each other. For example, Mississippi State could lose to Alabama and lose to Texas A&M. And they're probably top 10 if that's their only 2 losses. And then Texas A&M, if they beat Mississippi State and lost to Alabama, their only losses are to Clemson and Alabama, and they're probably top 10 with 10-2. So that's how you could get Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi State, A&M, and end up with 4. So 3-4 is your answer, I think.
So a couple of people are saying that the SEC East is trash and Georgia. I don't think that's true. I think that the trash in the East is really trash. Like Arkansas in the West is trash. And Tennessee and Florida are really bad. But I think Kentucky, Missouri would both make some noise in other conferences. Missouri let Purdue back in that game this weekend, but they won that one. I think Kentucky is, I don't think they're a great team, but we saw, what was it, 2 years ago, Kentucky beat Lamar Jackson. I think they won their bowl game that year. They got a great running back, got a good quarterback. I don't think the SEC is trash as it has been. But look, Georgia, if we're talking about Georgia's path to the national championship, Georgia's got their crossover games in the West are brutal. They got Auburn and LSU.
Yeah. it all kind of comes back down to the fact, right, that not everybody can win the SEC. And I wasn't saying A&M would be in over LSU or LSU being over Auburn. I was just giving different scenarios. If it's LSU or Auburn because of their schedule and the fact that they both play Georgia and Alabama, it's pretty much one or the other. LSU's already beaten Auburn. They have the inside track of it. Auburn would have to knock off one of the others, in which case they knock them down, et cetera, et cetera. You pretty much can't get more than 3 of that group. At least Texas A&M and Mississippi State doesn't play Georgia. But, yeah, when you start talking about, like, Kentucky could be a really good team and lose a lot of ball games. And it's just because they've got a really rough schedule. And, somebody has to win and lose. We talk about bag of wins a lot with conferences. Every year, the SEC in conference play has to go 500. They have to have an equal number of wins and an equal number of losses. Every conference goes 500 in conference play. And so when you see crap about, the Big Ten has so many 10-win teams, when they have a 9-game conference slate, who cares if you have 10-win teams or not? That just tells whether or not your conference is balanced. You can, like this year, the SEC is probably going to have a lot of 8 and 9-win teams, not because they're bad, but just that the conference is balanced and they're all going to win and lose to each other. And like you talked about 2015, probably end up with a really good bowl record because there are a lot better teams than the record indicated.
So
I'm speaking too loud here because I'm getting excited.
No, once you start talking about bag of wins, I know how you get. Somebody said something about Alabama scoring 14, losing 31-14. That's funny because I think it's reasonable if, a lot of, and this is what I talk about in the comments a lot of times, people kill us on both sides. They kill us when we pick a winner and we don't pick them big enough. If they kill us when we pick a loser and it's their team, and then they come back and tell us, I told you so, my team won. Well, yeah, you pick your team to win every week. We got to go on record and pick for or against 8 teams every week in what are generally pretty big, closely contested games. But I think it's funny when the people that are picking A&M in this game, and the scores are ridiculous. I saw one that was like 45-38 A&M, and then this one 31-14 on both ends of the spectrum. Like, Alabama loses games. Like, what was the score in 2012 when they lost to Johnny Manziel? Like, it was like 25, 23, 20.
Well, it was within a touchdown because if Alabama, they threw an interception on 4th and goal. Again, Doug Nussmeier, 1st and 4 with Eddie Lacy in that offensive line, and he threw the ball 4 times. But if they'd scored a touchdown there, they would have beaten A&M. So I know it was within a score.
Yeah, so Alabama doesn't get blown out. They've lost by double digits, something like 6 times in 11 years.
Yeah, they haven't lost by more than 14 points, I think, since 2007.
2006. They didn't lose by more than 1 score Saban's first year. So
that's 12 years.
Yeah. Since the Shula era, nobody has beaten Alabama by more than 14 points, and it's only happened 14 has only happened 3 times, I think. Utah,
Ohio State,
and
Oklahoma.
And Oklahoma was a kind of a backdoor 14 because they got that phone. Anyway.
and note they're all out of conference.
Anyway, when Alabama loses, it's generally close, and a lot of times it is in that 26-24 type point. We love A&M, so don't take our pick to mean that we're not high. I actually picked A&M to beat Clemson, which means I covered that game. I think A&M's great, especially at home. That's a crazy game. Let's step outside of the SEC for just a minute. We got to talk about Florida State. We started when we're having technical difficulties. I try to bring them up. We got to talk about Florida State. What in the hell is going on down there? This is unbelievable. They're not just bad. And what I don't understand is, and somebody said earlier in the comments today, Saban's got all these 5 stars. He should win every game by 50 points. And I'm like, look at Florida State. That's not the case. But how do you take, because they recruit really well down there, how do you take 4 and 5-star city and you can't just beat Syracuse, you lose bad to Syracuse?
There was an article today that now I wish I read that was trying to tell the story of the offensive line. The first thing I'll say, and Daniel can corroborate this, we talk on different forums and stuff, but the 2 hires that were made a couple years ago, PJ Fleck at Minnesota, and at the time it was Tiger at Oregon, I could not have been more critical about those 2 hires. I do not think very highly of PJ Fleck. I think he's a snake oil salesman. And Taggart he's only had, I think, 1 year where he finished better than 7-5. That was his last year at South Florida. And here's an interesting point to me with both those guys. They were never offensive coordinators. They were never coordinators before they became head coaches. Fleck came in as an assistant coach from the NFL, and Taggart was promoted as an assistant at Western Kentucky, I believe. But I've also found it interesting that Taggart comes from the Harbaugh tree, and the Harbaughs consider him an adopted son. If you were not aware of that he was he coached under Daddy Harbaugh with the two Harbaugh brothers. But interestingly, even though both brothers were coordinators for Daddy Harbaugh, Taggart was never more than a low-level assistant. I think he was like a tight end coach at best. So I don't think Daddy Harbaugh ever thought that highly of Taggart either. I think he probably could be a good coach, but I worry when you have a guy that was never a coordinator, especially never a coordinator at a major school, and you put him in a place like Florida State. We talked about Alabama's binders. How do you know how to run a program? Because it really is like being the CEO of something. There's a million things you have to manage. It probably giving away a little bit of myself, but I'm an attorney in a national law firm, and you see like the big partners. That's a tough job running high level of a big organization. And it's tough for guys like Taggart, I think, to step in there, and it'd be like me trying to take over like a huge client. How the heck do you do that? You're not going to be able to do it very well. And, beyond that with Florida State, first off, the offensive line is terrible, period. And you're not going to be very good if they're terrible. But there was one play in the opener against Virginia Tech we talked about. They almost took a safety, and there were three guys that got the Francois. And the first guy was the left tackle got whipped. So that was talent. The second guy was the running back didn't know who to pick up and let him go. And that was coaching and a player issue. And as Cam Akers may be a great back, but he's terrible in pass pro. And the third thing was their center and their guard completely misaligned and let a guy go free. So the point being, there were two coaching errors and one talent error. And I feel like, and I'll stop talking because I've talked too much here already, but watching them, it's a combination of really disjointed pieces and not having everybody you need at every position. So like Adonis Thomas was a cast off from Alabama playing linebacker. He's completely lost all the time. He doesn't need to be on the football field. And it's also millions of schematic issues, and they have a ton of penalties, and they're just poorly coached, and they're not well designed. I remember I saw a play where they ran trips, and they threw a tight end screen where they had their playmaker receiver in who's sub 6 foot. He's like 5'8", 170. And they had him blocking the linebacker, and they threw it to the tight end. Why in heaven's name would you not throw to your most dynamic player on the team and have the tight end block? Because schematically it's the same thing. You just align them the other way, so you have your worst blocker blocking and your slowest player catching the screen. That's the kind of stuff they're doing right now that's just baffling.
A lot of people asking for LSU. Somebody asked talk LSU Georgia. I think that this is interesting because we talked about how Alabama would be a tough matchup, maybe a tougher matchup. Auburn would maybe be a tougher matchup for Alabama than LSU. I think LSU could throw some things at Georgia that would really mess them up. The problem is that you run into a little bit of the same issue you had with Jalen Hurts in the game last year. You got an elite defense and a quarterback that's not that dynamic. I don't know if he's got the toolbox and the skill set to really stress that Georgia defense, because you're not going to run on Georgia, to stress that Georgia defense, because the only way you take advantage of Georgia is throwing the ball. And that's the only reason, y'all, Georgia fans are beside themselves that we thought that Missouri might score some points this weekend. Missouri might score 30 points, but Georgia might score 50. I don't think that, and this is something we meant to say at the end of the preview, that this game for Georgia is a show me game, not to show me if you're good enough to beat Missouri, but show me if you're one of the top two teams in the country. I think anybody's got to have a quarterback that can really stretch the field and be very dynamic, and be consistent at each level of the field. And I don't know that LSU has that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but personally, I think LSU does present some serious challenges to Georgia in that this was my thing with Missouri when I said show me. I don't think it's not like I think Missouri is going to beat Georgia. I picked Missouri by 11, and people seem to take me saying Missouri might have some success in a game, by the way, that they're favored by 14, so 11 wasn't much off. My point was Missouri this year has actually run the ball pretty well, and they've done a pretty good job stopping the run. How does Georgia run the ball on them? How well does Georgia stop Missouri's run game? No one Georgia has played can run the ball worth a flip, and South Carolina is pathetic and has been all season. If Georgia's run defense has issues, if their front seven's taking a step back, which should be expected, Roquan Smith was a freak, as were a lot of the guys in that front seven. LSU, and I think Georgia's back seven is athletic. I think LSU, that wants to run the ball almost every play, they can do that against Georgia because they're not going to be able to pass anyway. And on the flip side, for Georgia's offense is a lot more speed-based this year than power, I think. Swift is definitely fast more than strong. It's not like Chubb or Michelle were slow, but they were powerful guys, and Chubb in particular was particularly powerful. Swift may be faster than either of them, but he's not quite the power of those guys. Again, those were like first-round draft pick players. It's not bashing Swift. Not everybody can be perfect in every way, and I don't know that you can get the edge on LSU because of how athletic they are. So I think that could be a tough matchup. In many ways, a tougher matchup than Auburn, who doesn't run the ball well, so they can't try to push Georgia's young front seven. They're going to have to throw it. And Georgia's, Auburn on, the flip side defensively, their secondary is a little suspect. And I don't know. I think Auburn may be, or Georgia may be able to outspeed them better than they can LSU.
So they've been dancing around the TJ LSU dad for a while, and finally we got a $5 super chat because they really want us to talk about this. Jason, thanks for the $5 super chat. I will say, I love the guy. I mean, I think that it's one thing to present yourself as an objective, like we're very objective, and we go out of our way, and it's evidenced in the comments when both fan bases hate us and tell us we're homers for the other team. That tells me we're being objective. Everybody knows what TJ is all about. It's all about some LSU. Uncle Lou's the same way. It's all about being a fan and just being a fan to the max. And I love that about him. He's not trying to be anything, say anything that he's not. If he came on and said, I'm 100% objective and LSU is going to kill Alabama, then yes, he might have actual significant mental issues and need to be looked at. But he's not saying that. He's saying, I'm a huge LSU fan. LSU is going to beat Alabama. And you know what? I love that. That's what college football is all about.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. I mean, if you guys haven't been able to figure out my personality, I'm one of those guys that's kind of like cold and analytical to the max, and I'm one of them when you play a board game with that. I'm competitive in the sense that I feel like I want to know the rules and figure out how I can work with them. I don't even care if I win or lose the game. I find it interesting sometimes with some of those. I mean, there are some of those guys, and who is it? Who's the South Carolina guy?
Oh no, he's not he's just the guy that likes to scratch off lottery tickets on the
Carolina jackpot or whatever his name is.
I think he's got like 5 videos with that guy. Yeah.
I mean, it's so entertaining, right? Like you said, it's Tammy on Feinbaum. I'm not saying he's Tammy, but that's part of what makes college football great. But yeah, I mean, they know they're homers and they're playing to it, and it's fun. Uncle Lou, a lot of people ask him about Uncle Lou. Uncle Lou's entertaining. I think with Uncle Lou, he knows what he is, and he knows what he's playing to, and he's creating videos for the Georgia fan base, and he's trying to be entertaining with it. Carolina jackpot. There we go. Yeah, I kind of vaguely remember that. But those guys know they're catering towards a fan base, and they know you're not tuning in to hear, a breakdown of the top 10 statistical points for winning a game. Not everybody wants that. We know not everybody wants to hear our channel, but we're trying to cater to something that we don't feel like ESPN or a lot of other things are doing anymore. That's why we both kind of decided to do this. Quick aside, by the way, my wife was telling me that one, she's listening, and she said that I'm terrible to play board games with. This is true.
I believe it.
Two, by the way, if you ever do a live video chat and you schedule it in advance, don't let your wife find out when she listens to your podcast that morning.
Yeah, she she gives Josh notes because he shares them with me sometimes. Yeah, I agree, and that's kind of a point. When we first started talking about doing this channel, we could have gone in a lot of different directions than we went, chasing subscribers and views and probably more revenue. We could have grown this channel a whole lot faster. Every time we post a video, there is going to be at least 7 people who say, "Get to the damn point." And look, our videos just aren't for them. We have in-depth analysis on just a few games every week. Guys like Uncle Lou, they do a lot of content. I mean, he does a top 10. He does, a bunch of video, a bunch of game previews. We do a handful of games, and that's it. And we talk a long time. And y'all, I edit. Like, our videos now, we're trying to keep them under 40 minutes. I'm cutting like 10, 15 minutes of content every single video. And it's just because we're different. And like the thing we're doing is different, and it's objective. And we've actually gotten a lot of Ohio State fans and Notre Dame fans and Michigan fans saying, thanks for not being, just a trash talking whatever. And it's because we really do care about the data and we think it has something to say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we just we'll sit around in the off season and talk about all kinds of random things, news articles or stuff, and we'll dig into things. It's just our personality to like to sort of figure things out and break it all down. But yeah, no, it's fun. People talking about betting our picks. So neither one of us are really huge gamblers or fans of it. One thing I'll say, I did win the SB Nation pick'em, but you had to pick like 30 or 40 games a week against the spread, and I think I won it at like 60% against the spread that year. If you start calculating how much juice you have to pay when you do it, and the taxes off your winnings, and this is me being a more cold-hearted guy, you don't really make money. Even if I could consistently make, if I could return 60% and I bet $200,000 a year, I wouldn't make enough money to live off of. You can't do it. It is random risk. We talk about, a lot of times we say, we don't know who's going to win this game. These are the issues. Here's why one team probably will win, but here's the variability for the other team. You're always taking a chance and a risk. So that's my word of caution that if you bet on us, we like to talk about against the spread just to sort of be honest with where we're at and to keep track of ourselves, but it's not like we think we're invincible with it, and there's going to be years when we don't, we're below 500 against the spread. That's just, it's luck. There's always chance.
I don't agree with that. I don't think we're going to be below 500 against the spread. I used to bet a little bit of money for fun on some games. I did it for a handful of years with no data, and I never finished below 500. So I don't think that would happen to us. Like last week, we went 2-2, and I felt terrible. Like we went 2-2, and y'all, I have a coworker that does a lot of gambling, and she sent me 5 picks that she was making, and one of them I said I think Army covers, or I think Hawaii covers. Army was like laying 6.5, and they beat them 28-21. And then we were really close, 2 points off of covering Ohio State TCU. So those are always going to happen, but I wouldn't say I would have bet my house on Alabama Ole Miss, Alabama -21, but I was pretty close. But I don't like the swings. I don't like the wild swings, and I don't like the juice. So it's just not for me. I'd rather get this thing big enough and make all y'all some money instead.
Yeah, and as much as we're trying to do this in a way where, we get something out of it, we're really not looking to make a fortune off it. If it grew and we could make a career out of it, it'd be great. The unfortunate thing for you guys is, frankly, we've been extremely blessed, both of us professionally, to where, this is something we do as a hobby and would have to be very successful with it, extremely successful with it, for us to want to do it full time, as much as we love the sport. And I would do it if I could get to that point. But yeah, no, it just kind of is what it is, I guess.
Somebody said using 3 games worth of data, especially when there's so many lopsided matchups, doesn't make sense. You're right, and we say that early on. We say that for the next 3 or 4 weeks. You'll hear us say we still don't have a ton of data yet, But at some point, the season's only 12 weeks long. So we introduced the model because it's a fun talking point. Look, Alabama 57-2 this weekend. Of course that model's off, but it's a fun talking point. And within that data, forget about the score. Within that data, there's things to talk about. Muck the Duck is in the middle of a discussion about who our teams are and says there's a slight giveaway. And there's actually a story behind that. We had a different channel on YouTube, a separate channel that we were doing pretty well with, gaining some momentum our first year. And I made a handful of hype videos for, I think, Texas A&M, Tennessee, Alabama, Tennessee, Auburn, Oklahoma. And we got 3 copyright strikes in a day, all at the same time, instead of one in consecutive order where we could take them down and fix some things. We got 3 copyright strikes in a day, and it killed our channel. We had a friend of ours who had a dormant channel on YouTube, but it was like 5 years old. And for search, the longer channel's been around, it gives you a search boost. And he just let us have the channel. And he is an Alabama fan. So it says like the actual page is like Roll Tide something. So that's the story behind why our YouTube channel is Roll Tide whatever. It wasn't our original channel.
Yeah, and then I'll say, I'll tell the full story there, and that it was. So the University of Tennessee and a lot of SEC programs contracted with, I think it was XOS Sports and a couple others, and he was doing hype videos. There's another guy called Black Horse 09 that did some really good ones. And
he still does, by the way.
Yeah, he
does. And by the way, just one other interruption. Black Horse every week posts our videos when we do Alabama videos in the Alabama Reddit.
Yeah,
because I go to all the different ones, and he every week. So anyway, continue.
Yeah, well, it was technically the Tennessee Athletic Department, but it was really XOS Sports. We used 8 seconds of a clip they had in the university's video file for a promo for Texas A&M Tennessee, I think it was, and they hit us 3 times on that video for that 8-second clip because we had it in a couple different things. And took 3 strikes, and the channel was shut down all at once. So yeah, for 8 seconds of content that we were using to promote Tennessee football, we were shut down. We had to restart the channel. We were early enough. It was about almost a year's worth of subs, and it takes a while to get momentum enough to show up in search. So that's why, we picked up this channel where we had
almost quit. Like we really talked about quitting after that. It was
that was really frustrating.
Let's see. So somebody asked about UCF. I think it's fair to talk about. I think their claiming a national championship last year is ridiculous. I'll do it real quick. One, they didn't have to play Auburn at Auburn. They played Auburn in Atlanta. And we saw what happened when Georgia played the same Auburn team that had an injured Kerryon Johnson. They throttled them. So if anybody else would have had that opportunity, the same thing would have happened. They didn't have to play a cumulative Power 5 schedule. They got to play Auburn at the end when it was their Super Bowl and Auburn's whatever consolation prize.
Auburn that had been injured because they'd had to play SEC teams.
Correct. That's the other thing. So no, you weren't a national champion, but I do respect that program. I respect any Group of 5 program that can win a ton of games because it's so hard. That is, we talked before about winning with 5 stars and 4 stars and coaching. That is 100% coaching because everybody you play is getting the same pool of players. And then, by the way, you play 3 or 4 teams a year that have objectively better players than you. So I have a ton of respect for any G5 team that can win like that, have a season like that. I have even more respect for ones that can sustain it. If they go undefeated this year, I'm of the opinion, let them in even with a weak schedule. If they blow everybody out on their schedule, let them in and either show that they can do it or don't.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And I'll give a little more of a substantive take, I guess, on UCF that year. My thing with UCF, one, you got to give credit for somebody being undefeated, but you also have to be a little realistic on who did they play? Is it fair to the teams that played a harder schedule? One, the simplest point is that UCF didn't beat anyone that year that could have beaten any of the other teams that were in the playoff. Okay, they didn't play anybody that was even capable of beating the other playoff teams. And so it's not fair to the teams that did play several teams that they didn't. The second thing, and this was kind of our bigger point, if you're in that position, you can't beat SMU by 7 and Navy by 10. And I'm trying to remember, they were overtime with number 20 Memphis. That was their only ranked win, and it was in overtime. A 7-point win over USF. Those were all unranked teams. If your schedule is that weak, and I know part of it's not USCF's fault. I mean, part of it, it's hard to say who they reached out to schedule. It's hard to schedule those games. But, yeah, you've got to do the few good borderline top 25 teams they had, they were within 1 or 2 scores of. And those were teams that the other playoff teams that all consistently, Alabama and Ohio State were beating that level team by 3 or 4 touchdowns. So that was kind of the marker the playoff committee looked at. And I don't know. I don't know if UCF will play anybody anywhere. I heard an interesting story one time that Boise had reached out to Alabama about playing a game, and Alabama was willing to play Boise neutral site, but Boise pretty much at the time, I don't know if it's still this way, would not play anyone unless they agreed to a home and home because they wanted those big name teams in their home stadium. And for SEC teams and whatnot, they're not going to go to a stadium that only holds 50,000 people and doesn't have enough tickets for their fans and is a horrible travel destination. They'll play you, but they want to actually make money off the game to support their own program. And 2, they want to be able to, have their fans go watch the game somewhere like, Jerry World where they can bring 50,000 fans.
Horatio said he was looking for Alabama USC. If you mean USC and Southern Cal, it should still be out there. Just go search on the videos tab because that was post whatever issue. If you mean USC from 2010, we do not have that. USC, the Gamecocks. Southern Cal, USC fans actually got super pissed at us when we did the Stanford game because I kept calling them Southern Cal. But we have a USC in conference, and I say this all the time, I'm married to a South Carolina graduate, so I say USC all the time, referencing South Carolina. There's no disrespect by calling them Southern Cal. I completely disagree with any. Apparently, Lou Holtz called them Southern Cal one time as a jab. I don't know. Somebody said them being not ranked, their opponents not being ranked is part of the bias. That's not necessarily true because you look at they played a close Memphis team that year. They played Memphis. I think it was close in the bowl that year, and that was one of their ranked teams. And Memphis had losses that year. The teams that they were playing were getting skull dragged by P5 teams. That's the problem. And so, no, it's not that it's bias. As if anything, the national media is dying for anybody but SEC, anybody but Alabama right now, because they're losing interest across the board because of the lack of parity in college football. Any story with parity, any opportunity to rank people that aren't your normal ranked teams, they're pushing it hard. Look at Houston a few years ago, man. I mean, if Houston didn't make the playoffs, I think they lost that game late. If Houston didn't make the playoffs, there would have been a riot in the sports media. So I do not agree with it, that there's some bias that's keeping an undefeated G5 team that's steamrolling everybody out of the rankings. Look at Boise State.
Yeah, I agree. The bias that's keeping them out of the rankings is that they don't have the opportunity to beat someone to prove that they deserve to be high in the rankings. That's the truth of it. We complain a lot that the playoffs, really the AP, I think the playoff committee, by the way, well, maybe this is a point I'll let you get to in a second. I actually think the playoff committee does a pretty good job in not following what I'm about to talk about. The AP and the coaching poll is terrible about just ranking you in order of win-loss record. And they also will look at your win-loss record against ranked teams. But you tend to move up by beating a team ranked higher than you. The thing that kills group of fives is they don't play top 15 teams, so they can't move up. And in a sense, both. I understand the point that it's very unfair to them when they happen to be really good, they can't move up. But the problem is, if you want to get to that point, you need to do what Boise did a few years ago or several years ago and schedule a team you expect to be a top 15 team every year so that when you're really good, you can play in the playoff. If Boise in that Kellen Moore era had been in a playoff format, Boise would have made the playoff. If you go back and look at it where they ranked, they would have made the playoff in those years because they were playing with like an Oregon or a Michigan State that was really highly rated to open the year. Teams right now, the group of five teams that have done well have not scheduled that way. And then the teams that do schedule have lost those games. And that's what's that's what's kept him down. By the way, I'm always going to pat myself on the back that I can say this and nobody can obviously verify it, but I always held that it wasn't really Kellen Moore. It was Doug Martin that made Boise State really good. And I've always felt like the NFL vindicated me on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Somebody said they're talking about Alabama scheduling, and they're talking about SEC teams playing neutral site games, and they're always in the Southeast. So the neutral site game thing is something that Big Ten fans especially kill SEC teams for doing. They kill Alabama for doing it without remembering that Alabama did play in two national championships. Well, in 2010 and 2011, they played at home and home in Penn State. These neutral site games are huge for recruiting, and they became popular as Nick Saban and really the SEC really got going in this run. But don't forget, they also play in Dallas and Houston, which is not the Southeast. And a flight from the Midwest to Atlanta is no tougher on a team than a flight from Birmingham or Tuscaloosa to Dallas. It's also kind of, I mean, I get it. I think as a fan, we want to see more home and homes. I certainly do. Georgia did a great one with Notre Dame. They went up there last year. That was a huge game. Alabama just signed on home and home with Texas. But the neutral site games, you forget. So every other year, you have them at home. So if we're talking about tough schedules, every other year, you have a big-time out-of-conference Power 5 team on your campus with your fans with a 90-10, 95-5 crowd split where these SEC teams never get that. And it's not, I don't even Washington this year, it was 60-40, so I think that's worth noting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the complaint is usually where the game is played, which I get to a certain extent. The home and home thing, like you said, they're just irritated that they don't have a better shot to beat the SEC team because they at least have one at home. That's honestly, there's a little bit, I think there's a truth to that they hate that it's a neutral site because they don't get a game with a home field advantage to try to win. But the truth is it's neutral. It's, the SEC team doesn't get a home field either, but they say, well, it's a home field because it's in Texas or what have you. Like you said, if you're in, if Alabama's playing Michigan and in Texas, it's a 10-hour drive or so from Alabama to Texas. It's not like it's close to them either. And sometimes, some of the Big Ten teams travel well. A lot of the SEC teams travel better. But the bigger deal with a lot of that, too, is all the really nice new bowl game venues and all the nice new domes are in the South. The Falcon Stadium and the Cowboy Stadium are phenomenal, and they happen to be in the South. If they were in the North, maybe you have a different discussion. And especially if they were in the North, if that region was as crazy about college football, where the people that run those stadiums were willing to try to promote something like the Chick-fil-A kickoff, then you might see them in the North. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that, the people that own the Packers Stadium, the Green Bay Packers, are not looking to try to put college football teams there in an opening week. And that's half the discussion.
And I'll also add that a lot, especially for fans in the Big Ten that are killing SEC teams, a lot of Big Ten teams have been part of these neutral site games. Wisconsin, LSU, Wisconsin, Alabama, Michigan, Alabama. So the only one that hasn't really been a part of it is Penn State, and it's because they go Pitt, Akron, Georgia State out of conference last year. And it's something similar this year. Their big time out of conference game, and I know they had renewed that deal with them, and it's a big thing for the state, but their big time out of conference game is Pitt, who is terrible. And then, oh, by the way, they get Maryland, Rutgers, Illinois all in conference. So Ohio State fans can say something about scheduling. But because they are one of the top 3 or 4, Oklahoma, Southern Cal, Ohio State, Notre Dame, in scheduling in general out of conference. Really, nobody else can say anything. Michigan played Florida in a neutral site game last year. So you're taking part in these too. ACC plays FCS teams. Washington, up until this year, last year they went Rutgers, some directional school, and some directional school out of conference. So
yeah, and I'll pitch in as he said, my wife sends me notes. Then we both have somewhat football savvy wives. She mentioned the recruiting thing. which is a big deal that a lot of people don't understand and why they go to where they go. You are given certain recruiting allowances, if you're unaware of this, when you have a neutral site game, that kids are allowed to get tickets to a game for free if there are so many games within such a distance from where they live. And you're allowed, I think it's like one game you can give tickets to a year that is not in your home stadium. So a lot of these neutral site games are, as much as anything, it's everybody wants to go where the talent is. And it doesn't matter if you're Ohio State or if you're Alabama, there's a lot of talent around Atlanta and there's a lot of talent around Dallas. So one of the reasons they do those games is you play a neutral site in Dallas and then they get a big allotment of tickets they can hand out. And they give those tickets for free to the recruits in the Dallas area or the Texas area. And they're in driving distance to the game. So they go to an Alabama game, or Ohio State will do it for the same reason, or Michigan, because they'll go and see a Michigan game. And so, by the way, I'll tell Daniel so he can hear me, but I'm on no timeline here. I'm really enjoying the discussion, so I'm happy.
I am too. My wife's asleep, although she did message me and ask me how it went, because I was worried about the technical side of things, and we saw how bumpy it was earlier. There's a discussion about Clemson right now and the team that beat Alabama, and someone said that Clemson, this is Dabo's best team. I disagree, and here's what I think is interesting. The 2016 Clemson win over Alabama, if you swap the quarterbacks on that team, Alabama probably wins that game by 3 touchdowns.
Yeah, I maybe more than that. One, going into that game, I'm not a slave, to be clear, with S&P. There's just not many really good analytical ratings out there. And again, I look for objective data points. So it's not just me talking, out my rear end. S&P had 2016 Alabama as the best team they had recorded ever up until that game. And really they lost that game because they didn't have a quarterback, because they couldn't throw the ball. If you put Deshaun Watson on that Alabama team, that would have been the best statistical team that they'd ever recorded. But Clemson did have Deshaun Watson. He was an incredible football player. And they also had they had more depth on the defensive line than they have now, or especially, I guess I should say the front seven. And I think, there was that receiver, that Wallace dude, who was a pretty darn good football player. And he also had a really big hand in them winning the game late. And even still, if Alabama had been able to just sustain a drive when the starting running back went out, they would have won that game. So I'm with you. I don't agree. I think Clemson has some flaws this year. I don't think if you remember, the past couple of years, I've said that I wasn't sold that Clemson's back seven was that good against the pass. It's just their front seven was so good they would dominate. And this year, the front seven, and you've talked about this a lot to me, so I'll let you take over in a second. They're really, really good in run defense, but they're not getting a ton of pressure on the quarterback. And some of the cracks that I have been suspicious about in their back seven, I think, are starting to show up because they're not rushing the passer at a very high level.
Yeah, and maybe some A&M fans can chime in on this, but we all heard about how great Clemson's front four was, and we even talked about it on the show. And ESPN hyped it up a lot, and I actually thought in terms of rushing the passer, A&M was more disruptive than Clemson was, especially interior defensive line. They were getting at it all night. So I was actually, as a run-stopping front four, they were excellent. But overall, I was a little underwhelmed with Clemson's ability to get to the passer. And I know all those guys will play in the NFL, but it didn't either. A&M's offensive line is elite, or Clemson's defensive line didn't have a good night, or they're not as good as we thought they were.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, but I think their offensive line's solid, and the defensive line's, as you said, is really, really good against the run. And in the ACC, quite frankly, I mean, when you're playing Florida State, that defensive line is that's going to be amusing watching Florida State try to block them. But when you play teams that have better offensive lines, that the lack of an elite pass rusher, and Farrell's good, and I get that, but it's just not quite the same as what they've had.
Somebody asked, discuss how Alabama can lose this year. I think the most obvious way is if Tua gets hurt. Although what Dan Enos is doing there as a quarterback's coach, what he's done with Jalen seems to be improving him a lot. But there's still, even with all the Jalen improvement, we talk about here's what an interesting point. Everybody's talking about how Jalen hasn't played or Tua hasn't played anybody yet. Although I remind them he kind of came in a stressful situation against a good defense last year. Tua hasn't played anyone yet, but Jalen is getting a lot of credit for being much improved this year. I think Jalen's much improvement is more a factor of him not playing anybody than Tua's. You can see the difference between them against the same defense in the same game, which is interesting because you see that dichotomy right there. We saw Jalen last year ball out against trash teams, and the year before ball out against trash teams. So I think there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on there. But I think the answer, the long-winded response is, Josh, how does Alabama get beat this year? I think the answer is Tua gets hurt or they read too many of their own press clippings.
I agree. Any team, we don't get too much into the emotional aspect of it. It is a factor in games. Stuff does happen. My biggest thing is if you want to talk about a game where they just don't show up or they play bad, I think it's just way more random than anybody gives credit to, and we tend to apply hindsight to say this is why they were obviously looking forward to the next game. Sometimes it's just early in the morning and you wake up, it isn't good. I will say I've been to over 200 football games in person, and I've been to most of the SEC stadiums. I'm a big college football fan, have been since I was a kid because my parents were that way. And sometimes you go to a game and as a fan, you sit there in the stands and you're like, this just feels weird. Like nobody's excited. And sure enough, the team has a struggle win. And that happens, but I just don't think it's very predictable. But like you said, if Alabama's a game, no one can beat. I don't know that there's a couple teams, Ohio State and Georgia, that can probably beat Alabama on a B game or a B minus game. But yeah, for most everybody else in college football, they're going to need a C game or worse. And it's something maybe I'm curious to hear your thoughts first, if you don't mind me changing topic. But people are bringing up Trevor Lawrence. I have my own opinion on Trevor Lawrence, but what's yours?
I have the same opinion that you've echoed already this year. I think Trevor Lawrence has a lot of talent and he's in the wrong system. And I think it's going to take a year of overhauling the system to conform to him. Even you mentioned the runs he had. Even in the runs that I've seen him where he's gained yardage and it's been effective for the team, he's looked very uncomfortable. That guy needs to be in a pass-first offense that's not relying on him making any kind of zone reads, not taking any hits, but just balling out with his arm.
Yeah, I agree. I think from what I've seen, Trevor Lawrence is a little too slow in his decision-making right now. And that's I don't think it's a long-term bash on the kid. It's week 4 and he's a true freshman. And you know what? He's a true freshman. Everybody has to adjust to the speed of the game and the clock that goes with it. I think he trusts his athleticism a little too much right now, and he underestimates the speed of the pass rush, and that could cause issues for him. But for the most part, it's exactly what you said, which is they're running sort of a RPO-based offense that's designed for Kelly Bryant with simple reads. Lawrence is more of the descriptions of him out of high school was that he'd be the next Peyton Manning. He was supposed to be the best quarterback in 5 to 10 years, but a lot of that was because of his ability to make reads and run a sophisticated offense coming out of a very complicated system out of Georgia. They don't give him the opportunity to show that or do that. And you get 4 practice days a week now in college football. The practice time is really, really limited. They can't implement 2 offenses in the same season. And until they flip over to him full time, and I think have to do it either in maybe bowl practice, but more likely the off season to where they can install it for everybody in the football field. They're not going to be able to teach the offensive line or the receivers or anybody else how to run those choice routes and the options and how to block and everything you need to do to be able to use Lawrence effectively.
We talked about this earlier in the show. Georgia, I think, because we're still talking about who could beat Alabama in the playoffs. I think Georgia is that team. I think they're built. From what I've seen from Ohio State this year, I think they're much improved with Haskins. I don't think they're there defensively. Their linebackers are a big concern for me if I'm an Ohio State fan. I think Georgia is the only team that's really built to potentially beat Alabama. I'm not saying they will, but I think if anybody's going to do it this year, it's Georgia.
Yeah, I would agree. Ohio State, I'm careful because I don't know if there's any Ohio State fans here, and I'm not trying to dog them. I was not impressed with Haskins. I thought he was going to look better than he did against TCU. Now, that was his first major start in a road contest, but he didn't look like the kind of guy you're going to need to beat Alabama. Fromm is a lot more proven at Georgia. Like we said, I think Clemson's running the wrong system right now. An interesting question nobody's brought up there is I'm going to be really curious what happens with Georgia with Fields, because from what I have seen of that kid, I'm seeing the same stuff with Fields to a large extent that I saw with Tua last year, and I know you saw with Tua when he'd come in with garbage time, where he'd step on the field and we were just like, holy crap, this kid is good. And for those that watched the last few games of the year with Alabama, we started picking scores if Tua played and if he didn't play, just on what we'd seen in garbage time. I don't know. And Fields is not the same kid that Tua is, but I'm not sure he's not the same kind of talent. That kid's really freaking good.
So you weren't impressed with Haskins, and he went 24-38, 344 yards, and 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. He had over 9 yards an attempt, and you weren't impressed with him against a good defense.
I wasn't as impressed as I thought I might be. Let me put it that way. I come across as too critical a lot, if people have noticed, and it's because a lot of times it's based off my expectations. With him, I mean, it's probably a little bit unfair, but there was a lot of Heisman talk, and I didn't see Baker Mayfield back there for Ohio State. Let me put it that way. I saw a really good quarterback. He wasn't Baker Mayfield.
Okay, well, if that's your standard for being good is a Heisman Trophy quarterback, then sure. I'm
not critical or unreasonable at all.
Somebody asked, can 3 SEC teams get in the playoffs? No. I wonder if 2 can get in. I think if both the East and West, so Georgia and whomever comes out of the West, which is probably going to be Alabama, but let's say it's whomever. If whomever comes out of the West is undefeated and Georgia is undefeated, I think the way it's going right now, both of those teams are a lock. What I would be interested to see is how, because last year, it was down to Alabama and Ohio State for that 4th spot, which is ridiculous. We all know you can't lose by 104 points. That's sarcasm, by the way. I said on the video that Ole Miss gave up 160 points, and 4 Ole Miss fans killed me for it. They said, no, it wasn't. It was 41 to SIU. Anyway, it's not Georgia Tech versus Cumberland.
There are we do make mistakes, guys, like the cards. We do post-production. We're trying to get the videos out really fast, and we'll make a typo, like saying I think the Alabama-Louisville game is 51-44. Obviously, we know that Louisville didn't score 44 points in the game, and obviously it's sarcasm when we say Ole Miss scored 160 points.
Right.
It's funny how people sometimes don't see that clearly has to be either a mistake or sarcasm.
So Ohio State lost 2 games last year, and one of the games they lost like 51-10 or whatever. I think it was by 31 points. Anyway, Alabama was the 4th seed, quote unquote, by the skin of their teeth. If Alabama and Georgia are both undefeated, let's say it's Alabama. Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship, but everybody thinks Alabama is just like far and above number 1. Where do you seed Georgia, and do they seed them 1 and 4 so they play each other to get them out of the way, to make sure you don't have another all-SEC championship game?
Those are both good questions. And, we had a discussion with Notre Dame fans on, I think it was a rival forum, on whether Notre Dame did or did not need to go undefeated, right? And my final answer on a lot of this stuff, and maybe it was a video too, I don't remember. There's way too many things going on in my life at any given moment. The answer usually has to do more with other teams. It's not really about Georgia and what Georgia does so much as how do the other conferences play out. The Pac-12 is going to struggle to get somebody in the playoff at this point. With Washington losing to Auburn, I don't see anybody really being better than Washington or coming out with a better record. So It's going to be tough for Washington to get over an SEC team, even at Georgia, with a loss in the championship game. And then, we had the discussion with TCU. TCU's lost to Ohio State. So let's say you end up with Ohio State being the champion, and then Clemson, TCU wins their conference, Washington wins their conference. It's the most likely scenario. Well, if you put TCU in, then Ohio State and TCU is also a rematch. So let's say those are 2-3 or 2-4. Well, you've got another set of teams that's already played. TCU didn't play a championship game, which, by the way, we've long held that the championship game, reason that really hurts you is less about being a conference champion and all that stuff. It's more the fact that a conference championship game usually gives you a chance to beat a top 10 team and have a top 10 win on your resume. But so I think Washington's out. So at that point, you're down to Ohio State, Clemson, TCU, and then Alabama and Georgia. And the question is, Alabama's going to get in if Alabama wins. So do you take the Georgia loser, or do you take Clemson, or do you take Georgia loser, Clemson, Ohio State, and TCU? Which one of those guys gets dropped? TCU, I think it really would come down to TCU and Georgia. And I think that would be a tough call. And it might depend a little bit on how the season comes out. I think if Oklahoma wins out, then you're pretty much done if you're Georgia. But if TCU wins out, because you already have another rematch, it probably hurts. And in terms of if they play 1-4, I absolutely think the playoff committee would do that. I think the playoff committee is going to seed them 1-4 in order of who's the best team and deserves to be here. But I think the committee has pretty clearly shown their commitment is to rank the best teams, it's really a hybrid of most deserving and the best overall teams, 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're going to slot them 1, 2, 3, 4, and they're not going to play towards matchups or location. They're going to try to do their job in ranking them 1-4, however that comes out. So
somebody said that Notre Dame gets in with a loss. I don't agree. We did a video on this actually, and none of y'all watched it. That's a joke, by the way. We said they probably needed to go undefeated because they've got to replace a conference champion, and if they lose to Stanford, they can't get in. But now the teams they play in the ACC, they do have Virginia Tech, which is helpful. But the other teams they play are Wake, Florida State, Syracuse. These aren't good teams. So they very well could end the season with two ranked opponents, Stanford and Virginia Tech, which we're not that high on Virginia Tech either. Southern Cal is bad this year. Got killed by Stanford. So they're gonna finish the season with two ranked teams on their schedule, which is not Notre Dame's fault, but they're also not killing teams. Michigan, Ball State, Vanderbilt are all one-score wins. Two of those teams are Garbageville, which tells me, one, it could be a 2012 situation where they go undefeated and get in the playoffs or whatever. But I think it's more likely if they're playing three consecutive okay to bad teams within one score, they're going to drop a game to an average team along the way, if not two.
Yeah, and he pointed out Stanford, and we were kind of talking about how it plays out. If they lose to Stanford, that in and of itself kills them, because Stanford at that point has a better argument than Notre Dame probably in the playoff. And if they don't, then they're still going to end up slotted between the pack. So that one game is probably an elimination game. And like you said, even still, their schedule, as it turns out, is falling apart in front of them.
Yeah, and they're getting bit like Alabama got bit last year with Florida State. It's not Notre Dame's fault that Florida State's on their schedule, but Vanderbilt's on your schedule and you barely beat them. And Ball State's on your schedule and you barely beat them. So if you're a playoff I guarantee you Georgia will not beat Vanderbilt by 5 points. No offense to Vanderbilt, but that game is going to be a rout. And so if you're wanting to be, considered among the elite, you can't say, okay, we beat a bunch of 7-5 teams by 5 points. You got to do better than that.
Yeah. I can't argue with it. I mean, you gotta do something to beat out the other conferences. Somebody mentioned if the SEC puts two teams in again, they'll change the format. It's so funny to me that happened. The two of us talked about this a lot, that the 2011 Alabama LSU game was the reason they moved to the playoff. And from a logical, rational perspective, it is the dumbest thing imaginable, because moving to a playoff, one, Alabama and LSU would have still gotten in. Two, the reason Alabama and LSU was in was because Alabama and LSU in 2011, I mean, LSU opened by beating Oregon, who I think won the Pac that year. And so they had pretty much already, like the SEC had a leg up on everybody. Alabama and LSU still would have gotten in. Alabama and LSU beat everyone on their schedule by at least 3 scores other than each other. They probably still would have won the championship. The only thing this did is in 2013, Alabama makes the playoff. And then, what was it? So the other years, 2010, Alabama might well have made the playoff, or LSU would have. And in 2009, Florida would have made the playoff. I mean, all this would have done, all the playoff has done is made it that much more likely that you're going to have 2 SEC teams in the championship game.
And somebody keeps pointing out, and we can go back to this, but it's been brought up a lot, that LSU ran all over Auburn and Brissett. Like, I said some good things about Brissett to start this show, but they ran for 2.9 yards per carry against Auburn, and Brissett had 3.6 yards per carry, which is not good. So if you're hanging your hat on something that we got wrong because we said LSU would have to throw to beat Auburn and they wouldn't be able to run, and we were wrong, we're actually right. LSU did not run effectively enough to execute the offense that they want to execute against Auburn.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And somebody said, how can A&M be a top 10 team if they go 0-2, or if they have 2 losses against Alabama and Clemson? It's simple. We just said everybody would have a loss against Alabama. It's not like, I don't like the notion that we rank people based on how many wins they're going to get on their schedule. That's not fair because everybody's not playing that schedule. And I heard Greg McElroy talking earlier today about LSU and saying he can't have LSU in the top 10 because the rest of their schedule is brutal and they're probably going to lose some of those games. That's asinine to me. It's not like would they beat the other teams you want to rank ahead of them on a neutral field? Not did they win the luck of the draw and have to play Alabama and Clemson and Georgia and Auburn. Like, are they the best, one of the top 10 teams in the country, or are they not? I think A&M actually is. I think they've stepped up on defense, got a good defensive line. Linebackers aren't a liability, and Kellen Mond, he's balling.
Yeah, and you rank team when a team loses to another team. The way I look at it from a rankings perspective is you have to rank them better than the teams they beat. Transitive property aside, if you're both 11-1, or if one team's 11-1 and they beat another team that's 10-2, you have to rank the 11-1 over the 10-2. I think that's kind of what you have to do. But like you said, ranking someone early based off their schedule is stupid. It really goes back down to the fact that they're ranking them based off purely, they're saying, well, this is what their win-loss record is going to be. Not, well, their win-loss record is rougher because simply they play harder teams than these other 5 teams. And these other 5 teams, you're also kind of implicitly saying, if they played that schedule, they'd lose too. It just so happens LSU has a hard schedule. And to get back to the original question with Texas A&M, they absolutely could be a top 10 team because, they lost to Clemson. They're probably going to lose to Alabama. But you still play Mississippi State, who's a top 10 team, and you're still playing an LSU that's a top 10 team, and an Auburn that's, I think, still a top 15 team. So Texas A&M has a chance for, quite likely or quite possibly 3 top 15 wins on their schedule, even if they lose to Alabama and LSU. And if they were to win those games, they probably will be a top 10 team because there are not going to be many teams in college football that will have multiple top 15 wins. Guys, and so I'm going to keep asking questions, but I think we probably got about 5 more minutes in us before we turn into pumpkins and Cinderella's spell wears off on us.
Somebody said Tua equals Russell Wilson, and somebody asked, would Tua be better than Russell Wilson in the NFL? That's hard to say because Russell Wilson's been a damn good quarterback in the NFL. So, and won Super Bowls and all that. Like, Tua's in his first year of starting.
I really see Tua personally, by the way. I see him as like a mobile Drew Brees. That's my comparison.
That's scary as hell.
But that's what I see. I as a passer, he reminds me of Drew Brees, but obviously he's a fun fact is that Tua and Jalen are listed, I think, exactly the same size. I think it's 6'1", 228. I saw that recently and it was kind of freaking me out. Tua's a dual threat mobile guy, but his arm reminds me of Brees.
I said earlier this week, Tua wins the Heisman this year if he stays healthy. And that was not my pick going into the season, by the way. Tua wins the Heisman this year if he stays healthy, and I think he's the number one player off the board in 2020.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm not, and neither one of us do hyperbole about players, like, ever. We never are like this, but I've not seen anything. And yes, he's surrounded by a lot of talent, but the throws he's making, again, so is Jalen Hurts. So is the guy who was 25.5 and 2, or 25 and 2.5, but I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, I agree. And remember, for those that have watched this, we were very vocal and critical. One, going into last year, I made the point that if Jalen Hurts had ever learned to throw the ball, make proper reads, and throw the ball effectively, given how good a runner he was and how talented Alabama was otherwise, it would have been a complete unstoppable juggernaut. And he never progressed, and we were very critical of Jalen for that. And basically, Tua is a lot of what we thought Jalen could be. Only he throws the ball better than he throws the ball as well as anybody has in college football the past several years. His accuracy is insane. But yeah, and then he also plays for an Alabama team that we felt like if they ever even got just good quarterback play, there would be an absolute flipping juggernaut.
All right. I'm going to go a real quick rapid fire because there's a few things coming up, and then you can go rapid fire, and then we'll wrap it up. Stanford is overrated. So is Notre Dame. Neither one of those are top 10 teams. And yes, I do think that Haskins makes it to New York City, is a finalist for the Heisman. We already said Florida on the Florida-Tennessee pick. That's it for me. What you got before we sign off?
Let me see here. Anything? Yeah, I agree. You mentioned Bryce Love. It's always hard to tell which one of us is typing in the comments at any given moment. Anything antagonistic, you can always assume is Daniel. And I'm only half joking with that. But I was really critical of Christian McCaffrey and a lot of the Stanford backs. They would run behind an offensive line that gave them huge gaping holes. Christian McCaffrey he's like 6'1", 200 pounds. He is a slot receiver. I don't care what anyone says. His build, his skill set, his 3-cone, he is a slot receiver playing running back. And he doesn't run through contact very well because he plays exactly like a slot receiver running back. I'm a lot higher on Bryce Love because he actually, in my view, is at least a running back. But he's still – all those Stanford guys have had a common theme a lot of times. They get really fast backs. They're really, really good athletes, but they benefit from the fact that they never have to deal with contact because the offensive line is so good. And what we see, what we saw with last year with McCaffrey and what we've seen this year with Love is when their offensive line isn't great and they have to deal with contact, the flip side of that is they don't have the power to deal with anybody getting a hand on them at the line of scrimmage. So yeah, that's kind of my take on all the Stanford backs. I always take them with a huge grain of salt, more so than – ironically, Derrick Henry at Alabama played behind a pretty crappy offensive line that had a ton of negative plays. And I felt like he did a tremendous amount in spite of Alabama in 2015 rather than the opposite.
All right, y'all.
I don't see any other good questions, and we are both turning into pumpkins.
I got a crying baby downstairs that I got to help my wife with. So, y'all, thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.
Yeah. See you guys.